I use this cardboard guide, which I've shown in my previous videos. It has different width markings. With it, pressing becomes much easier. Here I fold at about 2.5 centimeters from the edge. Since our hem is 2.5 centimeters, I fold again by 2.5 centimeters. The hem is double folded. Using the cardboard guide makes this very easy. No need to mark lines or use a ruler. It's very fast. After pressing, I temporarily pin the fold. This keeps the hem from shifting during sewing. Now repeat the same steps for the other sleeve and the bottom edge. Collar construction. Our collar consists of two pieces. This is the upper collar, which I prefused with interfacing. The lower collar is without interfacing. We start working with the upper collar. We have notches, the first, the second, and the center one. Mark the same on the other side. From the edge, mark 1 centimeter. Now we need to clip into this notch by 1 centimeter. The section between the notches must be pressed inward by 1 centimeter. This creates a frame. Now place the lower collar with the upper collar and stitch the top edge with a 0.7 centimeters seam allowance. After sewing the upper and lower collar together along this edge, press the seam allowance toward the lower collar. Then on the machine, understitch the seam allowance to the lower collar, stitching 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters from the seam along the entire length. After this row of stitching is complete, fold the collar right sides together. Pin the side seams, making sure the seam allowance is directed toward the lower collar. You can easily distinguish them since the upper collar is interfaced. Now stitch the side seams with a 0.7 centimeter seam allowance. The collar is sewn, it's almost finished. Now trim the corners so they turn out sharp. Turn the collar right side out. Shape the corners. You can do this with a needle and thread. Insert the needle carefully, pull slightly, and form the corner. This way, the collar tip becomes neat and sharp. Be careful not to damage the fabric. If your fabric is delicate, don't pull too hard. Now press the finished collar. Shape the edges with your fingers so the seam is straight and even without distortion. The collar is the face of the shirt, so take your time to give it a beautiful look. A beautiful collar shape is always achieved with careful pressing. Here's our collar preparation. Now we need to press the front-facing seam allowance to the wrong side twice by 0.5 centimeters. Repeat this with the second front panel. Next, stitch the facing edge 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters from the fold. Then press the facings along the notches at the bottom and center. Pin temporarily so they don't get in the way while sewing. Repeat the same steps with the other front piece. Now we need to sew the shoulder seams. In this video, I'll show you a premium finishing method. In my written instructions, I describe the standard method for sewing shoulder and side seams and setting in sleeves with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Here I'll demonstrate a method where all seams are enclosed without using an overlock or zigzag stitch. That's why I added an extra 0.5 centimeter seam allowance to the armholes, shoulder seams, and side seams. To stitch, place the front and back together, matching the shoulder seams with wrong sides facing each other. We sew with right sides facing outward. Sew with a 0.7 centimeter seam allowance. If you are sewing the standard way, as in the instructions, use a 1 centimeter seam allowance and sew right sides together. In this case, we sew wrong sides together. After sewing the shoulder seams, trim the seam allowance, leaving about 2 millimeters from the stitching. Now press the seam allowance. You can press it toward the front or back, it doesn't matter. Fold the allowance neatly, align the edges, and pin. stitch the allowance with a 0.7 centimeters seam allowance. This way, the raw edges are fully enclosed. Now, press the finished seams toward the back. Next, we need to attach the lower collar. Now, we need to attach the lower collar. Important, only the lower collar. Align the collar with the notches and pin it in place. At first, you can pin both the upper and lower collar, but remember, we'll be stitching only the lower collar. Match the notches carefully. Stitch the lower collar with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. The lower collar is now attached, while the upper collar remains free. Now stitch the upper collar to the neckline, starting and stopping at the hem fold line on both sides. Sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure your stitching line exactly overlaps the one used for the lower collar. Now we need to secure the collar with the facing. Fold the facing along the notch and pin. Do the same on the other side. Remove any temporary pins. Stitch along the facing at 1 centimeter. Now clip into the seam allowance, stopping 1 to 2 millimeters before the stitching line. Do this across the entire seam and repeat on the other side. Now press the seam allowance of the lower collar upward. Also tuck the facing end inside. Arrange it neatly and pin. Later, we'll trim the excess allowance so it doesn't show on the outside. Repeat on the other side. Now fold the upper collar over to cover the seam line. This hides the seam completely. Pin in place. Now stitch on the machine from one end to the other, 0.2 centimeters from the edge. Make sure the stitch line looks neat both from the outside and from the inside. For accuracy, you can baste the seam by hand first, so the allowances align perfectly. This way, the top stitching will be symmetrical on both sides. The decorative stitch is complete. Here's how it looks on the outside and on the inside. Now trim the excess seam allowance so it doesn't show on the right side. Cut away half of the allowance, leaving about 0.5 centimeters. Do this on both sides. Turn the collar right side out, shaping the corners neatly. Press everything carefully to give it a clean look. Be careful not to leave press marks at the seam allowances, since this is the visible side of the garment. Here's how the collar looks now. Next, we attach the sleeve. I'll demonstrate with one sleeve. Here's our sleeve. Check that it matches the armhole notches. Align them carefully. Pin the sleeve and armhole wrong sides together, the same way we sewed the shoulder seams. First, secure with pins, matching all notches. Now stitch the sleeve in with a 0.7 centimeter seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance, leaving about 2 to 3 millimeters. Press the seam allowance, then fold it over, smooth with your fingers, and stitch again with a 0.7 centimeters seam allowance to enclose the raw edges. The sleeve seam is now fully enclosed. Here's how it looks from the outside and from the inside. Press the seam allowance upward toward the collar. Repeat the same process with the second sleeve. Now stitch the side seams exactly the same way, as with the sleeves and shoulder seams. I won't show the entire process again, since it's identical. Pin the side seams together. Notice that at the underarm there are 2 seam allowances. To avoid bulk, press one allowance forward, and the other backward like butterfly wings. Now stitch the side seams with a 0.7 centimeters seam allowance. Repeat the same steps as before. Trim the seam allowance, press it, fold, and stitch again with a 0.7 centimeters allowance. When finished, press the seam allowances toward the back. Now top stitch the sleeve hem. Since we previously pressed the allowances, all we need to do is sew 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters from the folded edge. Stitch all around the cuff edge. After stitching, press everything neatly. This is how clean it looks. Now for the final step, finishing the bottom hem. First, we need to sew the facing corner. Remove the pins that hold it in place. Place the facing on the right side and pin. Note that part of the facing overlaps the hem. This is correct and intentional. Repeat the same on the other side. Stitch with a 0.7 centimeter seam allowance. Then turn the corner right side out. I don't trim it. This way it stays sharp and structured. Repeat for the other side. Now lay the shirt flat on the table. Here's the hem we pressed earlier. Trim away the small fabric corner that formed, so it won't be visible. Do the same on the other side. Now our hem is ready. All that's left is to stitch around the hem, 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters from the edge. When starting the stitch at the corner, it can be difficult to keep the correct height. I recommend marking a line at 2.5 centimeters to guide you. Repeat the same on the other side. Now we have a line to follow for top stitching. So all around the hem. We're done with the hem. Press it carefully. Now all that remains is to mark the buttonholes and buttons. For a men's shirt, buttonholes go on the left side. For a women's shirt, on the right. Use the pattern markings to place them. Here I've marked the buttonholes, and I'll highlight them for clarity. Now stitch the buttonholes on the machine, using the special presser foot. Next, cut open the buttonholes. Insert a pin at the end of each buttonhole, so the seam ripper won't cut too far. This way, the ripper stops at the pin, and the fabric won't be damaged. Cut all the buttonholes this way. Now we need to mark the button positions. I recommend marking them directly from the finished buttonholes, not from the pattern. During sewing, the fabric may have stretched or shrunk slightly. So place the front facings together, align them perfectly. Center everything neatly. Use a pen to mark a dot in the center of each buttonhole. This will be the position for the button. After marking all, sew on the buttons, and the shirt is finished.